All right, so are you ready to dive into this whole world of online movements? Because today, we're looking at whether these guys are the real deal. We've got this article about three pretty controversial figures. Milo Yiannopoulos, Dr. Jordan Peterson, and what was that last name again?
Roosh.
Right, Roosh. And it really gets into their stories, how their views have changed, and if it's like genuine or just clever marketing.
You know, the thing that really gets me is how the author focuses on this whole grifter idea. People using these movements for their own gain, which, let's be real, is nothing new, right? I mean, this history is full of people jumping on bandwagons for fame or money, and they use Milo Yiannopoulos as, like, the poster boy for this.
Totally.
Yeah.
The article talks about him blowing up during Gamergate, being all about Trump, even his like very public personal life. It's like everything was planned for attention. But then he becomes Catholic and says his past was all wrong.
Right.
Makes you wonder if he really changed or if it's just another calculated move.
It really makes you think, right? The author's definitely skeptical, and I can see why. Yiannopoulos has a history of, like, stirring up controversy and then changing his tune when it suits him.
Yeah, for sure.
Like, remember when he was a big deal at Breitbart? And then he was banned all over social media, protesters after his events. It really makes you wonder if this whole faith thing is legit or just another way to get back in the spotlight.
That's a really good point. And the article goes into some of those contradictions, like his stance on conversion therapy. How does that even fit with being Catholic? It feels kind of off.
Absolutely. And the author even suggests that his earlier persona, the whole race-mixing homosexual thing was all deliberate, almost like he was trying to make homosexuality more acceptable in certain conservative circles, like pushing those boundaries further than some traditional folks were okay with.
Okay, so we've got Yiannopoulos, the king of controversy, always changing. Now let's shift to Dr. Jordan Peterson. He's a whole different story, wouldn't you say?
Oh, completely different. The article paints Peterson as someone who was like a breath of fresh air, especially for young guys who felt like traditional values were under attack. He challenged things like, having to use certain pronouns and really push for self-improvement, but through a more traditional kind of old school lens.
Exactly. He was like the counterpoint to what some saw as like the extremes of progressive thinking, especially on college campuses. In his book, 12 Rules for Life, huge. That whole idea of personal responsibility, finding meaning and order, really resonated.
He really tapped into this need for stability, for clear-cut guidelines, which I think a lot of people found appealing, especially in a world that often feels chaotic. But it's interesting because, like the article points out, Peterson's own life hasn't exactly been a model of his own advice.
Yeah, talk about physician, heal thyself, right?
Yeah.
The article mentions his issues with addiction and family stuff, which, his critics ate up. Does the article say those struggles played a part in him turning to faith later on?
It doesn't directly connect them, but it does bring up this interesting tension. Like, on the one hand, you've got Peterson preaching self-control, responsibility, but then he's very open about his own struggles, which some might see as authentic. And now he's publicly exploring faith, even having that fascinating conversation with that Orthodox icon carver, Jonathan Pigou, grappling with some big spiritual questions.
And then there's his whole thing with the UN, which the article mentions. That definitely ruffled some feathers, to put it mildly. It feels like a head-scratcher. How does working with the UN fit with his whole critique of globalism?
It's definitely one of those things where his critics really jumped on him. But to be fair, the article also says he's backed away from the UN since then and has actually become more critical of some globalist ideas. So it's like, do we judge him based on his past affiliations, or do we consider that his views might have genuinely changed?
It's like, do people really change, or do we just see what we want to see? And I think that's what makes this whole grifter thing so interesting. It's like we have to look at our own biases, our own ideas about what's real and what's just for show.
Totally. It's easy to get stuck on labels and assumptions, but this article makes you think twice.
For sure. Okay, so we've got Yiannopoulos, the provocateur turned traditional Catholic, and Peterson, the self-help guru, wrestling with faith and his own issues. Which brings us to, well, Roosh. This is where the article takes a wild turn.
It really does, doesn't it? Out of all three, the author actually says Velizada's story, going from a pickup artist to an Orthodox Christian, might be the most surprising and maybe even the most genuine.
From pickup artist to Orthodox Christian, that's quite a jump. The article really hones in on his book, American Pilgrim, where he talks about this whole experience. What'd you think of that?
What's interesting is how the author sees this authenticity in Velizada's writing that the other two might not have. He's really open about his past, his struggles, and how his beliefs have changed.
Yeah, he's not hiding from those more controversial parts of his past, and there are definitely some doozies in there. But he's not bragging about them either. It's more like he owns them as part of his journey, but he's moved on to something completely different.
And what's fascinating is that even though he's found this more traditional faith-based perspective, he hasn't dropped his conservative political views. The article even mentions his views on, like, monarchy and race, which could definitely be considered pretty out there.
So he's found a way to make his faith and politics work together, even if it ruffles some feathers, which is a far cry from telling guys how to pick up women, which is what he was known for before.
It really shows how complex personal change can be, you know? It's not always a clean break. Sometimes it's about finding a way to balance beliefs and experiences that seem totally at odds.
It's almost like he went from wanting validation, from like outward conquests, to finding fulfillment in something deeper. The article mentions how he used to give these specific strategies for approaching women, depending on the situation, and now he's all about traditional family and values. It's a pretty big shift.
It is, and the author seems to think it's because of her real encounter with faith.
But it hasn't been smooth sailing, right? The article mentions some Orthodox Christians having problems with the specific type of orthodoxy he's chosen, even trying to convert him to their way of thinking.
Exactly, and that's really telling. Even within a faith, there's debate about what true belief really means and who gets to decide. It's not just about being genuine or a grifter, it's also about whose definition of genuine we're using.
That's such a good point. It's like we always try to put people into these neat little boxes, but real life is way more complicated than that. A lot of this comes down to individual interpretation and what they've been through.
Exactly, and that's what I think is so valuable about this article. It makes us move beyond those simple labels and really engage with the complexity of belief, transformation, and what it means to be authentic in a world that's overflowing with information and opinions.
It's so easy to judge quickly, especially with these bigger-than-life figures who seem to love controversy. But like we've been saying, there's usually a lot more going on under the surface, right?
Yeah, and I think that's the main takeaway here. We got to be willing to dig a little deeper, especially now with social media where it's so easy to like craft an image or even totally reinvent yourself.
It makes you wonder, what does being genuine even mean for these public figures? Is it about being consistent over time, or is there room for like a total 180? And how does that work with the things they've done in the past, especially if those actions don't match their beliefs now?
Right, and how much of our own judgment is like colored by our own baggage. We all come in with our own stuff. And it's important to remember that when we're trying to figure out if someone's sincere, especially someone who's always in the public eye.
It's easy to get caught up in the stories we tell ourselves about people, especially if those stories fit our own biases. But this article does a good job of challenging those easy narratives.
It really does. And it shows that people, even famous ones, are complicated. They contradict themselves. And maybe that's the most human thing of all.
It's so tempting to put people in these boxes. Grifters, saint, genuine, fake. But realistically, most people are somewhere in between.
Exactly. And that's the problem with slapping a label on someone just based on one thing, one moment in time. We miss the whole picture, how their thinking has evolved, what they've struggled with, what they've learned.
So where does that leave us? What do we do with all this information, especially with all these opinions of personalities thrown at us online all the time?
Well, I think the biggest thing is to approach everything and everyone with a good dose of critical thinking, you know? Don't just accept what you see or hear. Dig deeper. Think about the source. Look for inconsistencies. Ask yourself, why might this person be presenting themselves or their beliefs in this particular way?
And be open to the idea that people can change, even if it seems impossible or if it doesn't fit with our own views.
Exactly. Because in the end, it's up to each of us to figure out who we trust, who we let influence us, and how we deal with this crazy, ever-changing world of online movements and the people who run them.
So there you have it. 3 guys, 3 unique journeys, and a ton of questions about authenticity, what they believe, and what truth even means in the digital age. If anything, it reminds us to stay curious, keep asking those tough questions, and maybe not be so quick to judge. Thanks for diving in with us.